What's up, everybody? It's the Storm Writer. Today I'm going to read a story from my life, from my teaching life, when I was a classroom teacher at an affluent suburban elementary school. This is one of my hero stories from my teaching days, so it's one of my triumphs. And it's a triumph of intelligence and creativity, but then there's a sad ending to it. So I'm excited to share the story with you, and I don't need to read it word for word. I might a little bit read it word for word. I have the article in front of me as I wrote it on my Substack, but I really want to get to the meat of what's in the story rather than read the story word for word. So let me just jump right in. Don't worry, I changed the names of everyone in this story. I want to tell you a story about a child named Nikki. This is a story of how we may choose to interpret the information we take in. You see, the source of most arguments is the fact that one person interprets a problem completely differently than another, and that we may not really like how another person interprets the same problem we're both seeing. We may have a tendency to view a problem negatively, but we can choose to view a problem or challenge differently. Especially if we train ourselves, we can start to view certain types of problems positively. Now, I've found this to be incredibly important in the field of education, in the field of teaching. How you look at a problem affects whether a student becomes happy with your classroom or swears revenge against it. When you're a teacher, students and problems are intertwined. This is because when problems arise in the line of duty, they tend to come from or be presented by students. So we risk confusing problems with students. And that's why when I use the word problem in this article, I'm hesitant. We associate the word problem with negativity. Like when we say this child is a problem or he is a problem child. And I don't mean that. In fact, I'd like to separate the children themselves from the problems they bring. Students bring problems. That's just the reality. But they don't bring problems in a bad way. This word has too many different meanings. I mean that they bring with them puzzles or challenges. We can use these words interchangeably: problems, puzzles, and challenges. Students bring problems to be solved, not lamented. If a child brought you different Rubik's Cubes on every day, or brought you a different Rubik's Cube every day, and said to you, "Here, teacher, here's a gift for you. Solve this problem," you wouldn't be mad. They brought you a puzzle. They're testing your wits, and it's a game. Let's play. Every child is a puzzle bringer, a problem bringer, and a challenge bringer. But they themselves are not problems. They are not puzzles. They are not challenges. At least, not to me. That's my mindset. And that mindset brought me a lot of success in the early days of my post-grad teaching. This theme of the problem will become very important, and this is something that every teacher faces. They're faced with problems that are connected to students, but they must learn that there's a trap here. There's a trap of thinking of a student as a problem. There's a trap of thinking of a student as a negative thing, and it's completely unacceptable. When we take a step back and we look at ourselves and our role in teaching, it's completely unacceptable that we would say that this child is my problem, is a problem in the classroom. No, this child is sort of one of the objectives, right? So how can the objective be a problem? How can the purpose of my work be a problem in and of itself? This would be like saying, math is the problem with teaching math. It doesn't make sense. So we run this risk when we deal with human beings because human beings are difficult. And we have to be careful in how we conceptualize the reality or the situation. I was an art teacher in an affluent elementary school in the suburbs, and as a result, I saw students for about 50 minutes once a week, meaning I had 25 different classes, and I saw each group of class, I saw each class once a week for 15 minutes, and that allowed me to teach 5 to 6 classes a day, and in the end, I had 25 classes. I rotated between all the grades from K to 5. I remember Nicky as being in the first grade. Maturity-wise, he was almost a kindergartner, but not quite. I recall that he had an older sister in the third grade, and they were both bright and very precocious. Nicky had trouble managing his emotions and controlling himself in the classroom, and would basically freak out if he was reprimanded in the traditional way. By this time in my career, I wasn't an experienced teacher, but I had gotten my licks in the classroom. I had learned that with students being creative always beats being tough. Being tough or strictness has its place. But I read somewhere in my studies on classroom management that what works with the typical student does not work with students who have a special education plan, or have trouble controlling themselves or regulating their emotions. And this means that you react differently to a regular student who gets off task and doesn't follow directions than to the special ones. I heard a term that one student came up with, or one teacher came up with for them, a frequent flyer. Actually, I really remember this teacher. She was training me when I worked at another school before I went to grad school, and I remember her name was Chandra, and I think I got the term frequent flyer from her, but I never really made the connection. And a frequent flyer, my frequent flyers were students who might fly off the handle frequently. So they're frequent flyers because they fly off the handle frequently. I'm just now realizing how well that works, is what I wrote. So Nicky was in the first grade. He had special needs, so he had a one-on-one paraprofessional who was to be with him at all times. His paraprofessional was actually a young man about 25 years old and approximately 6'3" with handsome features. He was a good-looking dude, and I later learned that he was of Greek descent but born and raised in Massachusetts. I want to say his name is George. Once again, fake name. I know his name. George was a little stiff when he came in with Nicky that first time, and I picked up on the body language. They had told George that he had to keep Nicky in line, so I'm sure that Nicky had problems keeping his hands to himself, and it was a safety issue. I recall also being informed about this when I met the classroom teacher. First grade teacher. Hello, Mr. H. This is Nicky. Me. Hi, Nicky. How are you? Hi, sheepishly. Nicky has the demure vibe of a tiny Bruce Banner who could become the Hulk at any moment. The kids have all sat down. Mr. H., can I have a word with you for a moment? The first grade teacher is gesturing away from the little meeting area, which means they want to be out of earshot. I was just about to start, so I'm nervous because this is the most important time in the class. If I don't catch him now, I might not be able to wrangle them ever. He explains to me that Nicky has problems with behaviors, emotions, self-control, etc. Blah, blah, blah. It's important stuff, but yeah, this isn't my first rodeo. Every grade has at least one student who can turn into Banana or Catwoman at any time. Okay, I got it. Is there a faster way to say this? So basically in my mind, this is my internal monologue. It's like, okay, I get it. Yeah. He flies off the handle. We get it. This is not the first one. Okay, so I'm briefed on Nicky. He's a frequent flyer. No problem. Frequent flyers are my specialty. I think to myself, this is going to be fun. That day we're working with collage, shapes cut out of construction paper and crayons. Well, collage is shapes cut out of construction paper, but that's not enough by itself. So we introduce crayons and other types of drawing materials into the collage to elevate the interest. We're making abstract collages in the vein of Henri Matisse. I'm showing them Henri Matisse first, and then we're cutting out shapes and inventing shapes and making collages. Nicky isn't allowed to sit with the other kids, so he's at the red table. It wasn't my decision. The regular classroom teacher requested this, and I had to comply. I'm more of a let's see how it goes kind of guy, especially with the little ones. I'm standing up as all students are making collages, hovering from table to table, helping students, when suddenly there's a breakdown. I see George grab something from Nicky, probably the paper. It's likely Nicky wasn't using one of his materials properly or safely, and George's alarm bells went off. So as human nature suggests, George took something away to make the child stop, reset, and restart. Except Nicky is a frequent flyer. So he, of course, loses it. He screamed and cried and got down under the table, arresting the entire class with his voice. Now, I was, of course, a tiny bit regretful because I wish George hadn't reacted so swiftly. But I saw in that moment an opportunity. There was a break in time called an opportunity. I anticipated either the timing to step in and take control of the situation, or even just the need to take over and use trickery to turn things around. Trickery is a concept that the shaman uses to teach a spiritual principle to their disciples when conversation or instruction won't suffice. I learned this from reading conversations between Don Juan and Carlos Castañeda in his books about shamanism of the Yaqui Indians. Okay, I'm a little bit of a trickster when I teach. Every adept teacher must be a trickster as well as a straight arrow when needed. So when George grabbed Nicky's paper and then Nicky screamed and got down under the table, the straight arrow teacher would have said, "Nicky, get back in your seat right now." Instead, the trickster said, "Nicky," in a sing-song voice, "what are you doing under the table?" I became a fool, a clown, a court jester. And then I asked in the same exaggerated sing-song tone, "How are you going to do your artwork under the table?" Nicky went from screaming and crying under the table to laughing and listening from under the table. "Nicky, are you going to make your collage under the table?" Nicky is smiling now. "How are you going to make your artwork if you don't have your crayons? And what about your paper?" George goes along with my improvisation, and he's curious to see how this plays out. We pass him the paper under the table. Then we give him the crayons under the table. He's laughing because this is the funniest thing that has ever happened to him. The whole class is laughing too. No one is laughing at Nicky. Beware. But we're all laughing at the idea of doing artwork under the table. As a harmless, absurd, but never before thought of idea. And in a way, Nicky is celebrated for being a creative thinker, even if unintentionally so. What do you think of this hilarious reaction? What are your thoughts? Hey, you can comment in my podcast. And oh, by the way, this is a nice time to take a little break to say, please like my podcast. Please follow my podcast. Please comment on my podcast. Push all the buttons. Share your podcast. Share my podcast with whoever you think might be interested and people on your networks. This is just something I want to share with people. So if you would do that, that would be huge for me. And I try to push out episodes every week, maybe even more than that. All right, back to the story. Now, you might ask yourself, isn't this a slippery slope? Didn't you just make it acceptable or cool to get under the table and do your artwork? But the answer is no. None of the other children followed suit or tried to copy Nikki. They know that Nikki is a frequent flyer and has special needs. People need to react to him differently than the typical teacher's response. And what's interesting is that the kids in first grade all know that Nikki can't control his emotions, but they themselves can regulate by comparison. So they don't copy a child who doesn't have self-control. They're empathetic, but they don't jump on the bandwagon, which is why it's okay for me to de-escalate the situation between Nikki and George, or Nikki, frankly, and the whole world, including me, the art classroom, all the children, the entire school. By the way, we could all go on his shit list if he starts to lose his temper and see red. So it's not just about George, it's about all of us. When these kids get mad, everything gets lumped together. It's all just little kids and wiring is a sentence I'm tempted to say that might not make any sense at all. But I had to say this to myself. It's all just little kids and wiring, how things are wired. Okay. So, which is why it's okay for me to de-escalate the situation between Nikki and George. Anyways, with his temper tantrum avoided, Nikki is laughing his heart out now. He is completely happy and either making or pretending to make artwork under the table. Crisis averted. And the best part of the whole thing was that George took note of this, and he adjusted his way of interacting. He became more collaborative with Nikki and realized that establishing a collaborative rapport was a way of preventing blow-ups and freakouts. Generally speaking, we must always be prepared to see children's behavior differently than tradition dictates. Especially if they are one of the ones who think differently. Okay, I wrote this sentence terribly. Okay, one of the ones. But let me say this again. We always got to be prepared to see and think about children's behavior differently, especially when they are one of the children that think differently themselves. They have different minds. They have different wiring. They have different connections. And if we're told in advance, okay, this child thinks differently, then we as teachers have to be prepared to think differently with the child who thinks differently. You will never turn the child who thinks differently into the child who thinks the same. That will never happen. However things are going in the brain, you have to roll with what they have. Not reprogram them. We do not reprogram children. We do not reprogram. Reprogramming is not possible. It's not desirable. But many teachers before me and many teachers after me will make the mistake of thinking I need to train or teach or program, this particular individual, the frequent flyer, into conforming and becoming more like the rest. It's never going to happen. They have their own path, and you put them on their own path to success. They're not on the same path as everyone else, but they can also reach success if you think about things differently for them. And you're just going to have to be a shaman. You're just going to have to be someone who sees the beyond. You're going to have to be someone who sees things expansively rather than rigidly, linearly or regimentally. All right, so I'm going to get back to the story, but this is what I'm trying to say here. When Nicky was doing whatever he was doing, with his scissors, not holding them the right way or what have you, George saw it as the beginnings of defiance and the beginnings of a problem. When Nicky got down under the table, I could see George's mind go into gear. Now I have to do my job. I have to get Nicky out from under the table and back in his seat, no matter how loud or crazy it gets. I saw where that thinking was going. Right into a power struggle between a defiant kid and an irritated adult. That's a power struggle that I've experienced hundreds of times, and I've rarely won. So I snapped into gear like Michael Scott playing the fool. I made it. Just for now, just for today, okay to do your artwork under the table. Nicky, if that's what you need right now, we can make it happen. And just like that, instead of being a power struggle, Nicky was part of a play, a performance, or a comedy sketch. Nicky was not the problem child who couldn't sit still with other students, but the funny child who can do artwork under the table, on the table, or anywhere. And most importantly, just for today, Nicky was a happy child and not an angry child. I'm glad I had an impression on George. In the subsequent years, I took up salsa dancing, and by chance, his uncle was the owner of a salsa club that I would go to on the weekends. He would bartend there sometimes, and every time he saw me, he'd give me a free bottle of Poland Spring mineral water as a sign of respect for showing him something valuable. I really appreciated that as a way of saying, hey, the good stuff you do over there, it counts over here too. So I like that. Now, I know you think of this story as one of my successes, how I learned to see things differently. And it is. But unfortunately, this is really a story of one of my failures. Because in the end, I lost Nicky. And he went right back to being an angry child over the course of the school year. It was not because of what I did, per se, but because I lost the battle with my colleagues who wanted to put their beliefs over my experience and proof of outcomes. One of the behaviorists employed by the school, you see the way I said that, who was not a teacher and had very little experience, made stupid decisions. This foolish behaviorist had way more control over Nicky's life than I did. This is where I'm going to get angry. And instead of taking cues from my example, she thought that she had to become more and more strict, more and more controlling, and more punitive, until Nicky turned into a well-behaved child. Spoiler alert, I like using that word. Frequent flyers actually never turn into little, docile, obedient children. They are born for rebellion, and they will one day take over the world if things go right. And in your classroom, if they're properly understood and included, they can be an incredible asset rather than a threat to keeping order. She took her need for control to such a point that in the end, they actually built Nicky a punishment room, and they put him in that room whenever he needed to, in quotes, cool down. By the way, this was a suburban affluent school, so the very idea that they built a punishment room is especially scandalous. Let's put it that way. This happened, we're talking 2010-ish. Yeah, 2012-ish, something like that. So it's not ancient history. They didn't call it a punishment room, after all. This was an affluent suburban school, so they called it a cool-down room. But I had substitute taught in the inner city, and I knew a punishment room when I saw it. It was a small room the size of a small office, and And sometimes it would look like the interrogation room in a precinct. In this case of Nikki, this was his room just for him. So he would, excuse me. So it had no furniture inside. And Nikki was to go in there and throw a rubber ball around, hit the wall, scream, or do whatever he wanted to do until he was calm. By the way, this is like really, really bad psychology right here. It's really ass backward psychology. Many studies have shown this is actually bad for anger and aggression, not good for it. And it actually ramps up the anger and aggression. Okay. So what is it to say? I wanted to add in that there may have been like foam mats covering the walls and floor of the room. There may have been like foam mats like you get when you like in a gym, in the weight room in a gym, those kinds of foam mats. But that's still, he shouldn't be throwing himself around a room. I asked them, what if he hurts himself? The behaviorist just shrugged her shoulders and told me that a paraprofessional will be there to monitor the room from the little window outside the room door and make sure they're okay. Ramping up control is the strategy of the inexperienced and untrained educator. And I've many times been an inexperienced or untrained educator. So I know this better than anyone. But by now, I'm seeing this and I'm like, what are you doing? Seeing and recontextualizing how the child's actions are understood is one of the most important skill sets of the experienced teacher, because it creates miracle transformations for the child and the classroom as a whole. So when a handful of inexperienced, arrogant, or club-fingered behaviorists intervened to undo all of the progress I had made with Nikki, I recall making them feel small. I can barely recall it, but there was an occasion where I told one of the behaviorists that I had already fixed this problem before they unfixed it, and I knew better than them what needs to happen. I told them that they should have watched and learned from me in order to see what's best. Now, I'm only 2 years in. They think I'm like a 2-year, 3-year teacher. So the arrogance of this, I think I'm going to talk about this in the article, but I was the only male, only person of color. And also I was relatively new in my teaching career, but I had taken my licks early on in substitute teaching and in teaching in the cities. So my skills were pretty sharp when it came to the suburbs. Okay. Nikki is doing blah, 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 so we need to do this. I already fixed this issue. If you would have done what I've done, you wouldn't have this problem. It's really tough. People don't like it when you say, if you would have done what I had done, you wouldn't even have this problem. But that's the beauty of the perfect tense, right? If you would have had done what I had done, you wouldn't even be having this problem right now. I love that. I love the grammar of this, but it's not the most respectful thing to say to someone. But it was true. I didn't have the professional status at the time, so I was being really bold by shitting on this person. But someone needed to tell them off, or tell them to hold back or back off, given the kind of abuse they were headed towards. So I decided that I, the sole male and only person of color in this all-white, all-female staff school, let me redo that line. So people decided that I, the sole male and only person of color in this all-white, all-female staffed school, was an arrogant hothead. By the way, I'm Arab American as well, so that's perfect for the stereotype. And what can I say? Eventually, after a few years of my ego popping out here and there, I started to get bad reviews from my administrators, even though I was an awesome teacher, and I eventually had to go work somewhere else. Do you see what I did there? I wasn't threatened by the child's behavior, so I turned it into play, and I flipped the script. And everything was fun. But I couldn't do the same thing for a colleague who wanted to put an emotional child in a punishment room. And as a result, I essentially got under the table and started screaming. and no one flipped the script for me. All right. Thank you very much for listening to my story. There's nothing else to say. Check it out. Read it for yourself if you want to go ahead and do that. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what you thought, any way, shape, or form. You know, I have a Substack called the stormwriter.substack.com. And I don't know, man. It's the past. You know, all I can do is share these stories with you so that it can change the way you see the world and the way that you see children, and furthermore, the way you see us. There are people running the world who who got under the table, but they never got the laugh. They never got the teacher who used humor to make them smile. And as a result, even now, they're still under the table. They're still angry at the world. And if you give them power, if you give them control over the whole classroom, they're going to create damage and destruction. And we need to be compassionate towards the people who lose control over their emotions. And I'm really an advocate of that. But there's a huge difference between playing with Nikki and letting Nikki have control. And that's why I play, because I won't give up the classroom to Nikki's attention. I must make sure that we keep these things right-sized and we keep these actions right-sized. But the other problem I have is that stupid decisions are being made all the time in education, in politics, in governance, in economics, and I still don't understand why these stupid decisions are being made, given the fact that they're stupid decisions, right? So they poorly impact people. They're bad. They do excessive harm. They lack good reasons. They're made at the whims of various people. People are convinced by their own delusions that this is the right step or right way to go. It is not going to work, but we still cling to our stupidity. We're afraid to transcend our stupid assumptions about the world and grow and try different things. So I leave you with that as a meditation. What will it take for us to let go of our stupid fixations or the things we're attached to that we don't need, that we need, that when there's a better way and better path forward? And if you don't know a better way, that's okay. But if someone else knows the best way of doing these things and everyone's ignoring him or her, how do we fix that? All right, thank you everybody for listening to the podcast today. I'll see you next time.